This is my ranking of new RTS games from 2025 and 2026 that I've played based purely on my personal experience. Each one is placed from masterpiece down to trash, depending on how strong the strategy is, how balanced the systems feel, and how well they reward smart real-time decisions. Let's get straight into the list. Fragile Existence instantly caught my attention because it mixes survival strategy with a desperate sci-fi escape story instead of the usual empire-building formula. I liked how every decision felt risky, since losing ships also meant losing people, resources, and progress, which made battles feel far more tense than most RTS games I played recently. Managing the refugee fleet while searching planets for materials kept me busy the entire time, and the seamless switch between space management and planetary operations added a lot of variety. The slow pacing may not work for everyone, but I enjoyed the heavy atmosphere and constant pressure of staying ahead of the enemy threat. It still looks rough around the edges in some areas, though the scale and ambition are hard to ignore. This lands in my great tier. Tempest Rising immediately reminded me why I miss classic Command and Conquer style RTS games, because it captures that fast-paced base building and explosive combat formula extremely well. I had a great time balancing resource gathering, building defenses, and constantly managing units during chaotic battles where mistakes could destroy an army within seconds. The two factions feel distinct enough to keep matches interesting, especially with the Dynasty's aggressive defensive tools and the GDF's advanced drones and heavy vehicles. I also liked the upgrade system between missions, since it gave me more freedom to shape my strategy instead of following a fixed path every time. The campaign story and characters are weaker than the gameplay, and some missions feel too familiar compared to RTS classics. Even with that, this earns a spot in my excellent tier. Broken Arrow gave me the kind of large-scale, modern military battles that are hard to stop thinking about once everything starts exploding across the map. I liked how detailed the combat felt because positioning, air support, armor, and infantry all mattered at the same time, which kept battles intense without turning into complete chaos. The roster builder became my favorite part since I could spend ages customizing units, testing different military specialties, and building strange combinations just to see if they worked. Watching helicopters, drones, tanks, and artillery all collide during massive fights looked incredible, especially when matches escalated into full battlefield destruction. The game still has rough edges with bugs, limited skirmish options, and missing quality-of-life features that should already exist. Even with those issues, I still place this in my excellent tier ranking. Stronghold Crusader Definitive Edition reminded me why classic castle-building RTS games still feel special even after so many years. I spent hours balancing food production, taxes, farming, defenses, and military strength while slowly transforming a weak settlement into a heavily fortified fortress prepared for massive sieges. What I enjoyed most was how every system connected together, because losing villagers or supplies could completely ruin a strategy if I stopped paying attention for too long. Watching archers defend walls while siege weapons smash through enemy gates still created exciting battles that never became boring. I also liked how much content was included through campaigns, skirmishes, and co-op missions that kept giving me reasons to continue playing. The pathfinding and slower pacing can still become frustrating, but this easily secures a place in my masterpiece tier. Good tier. Global Conflagration immediately felt like a modern attempt to recreate the Command and Conquer General's formula with faster combat, simple base building, and large armies constantly smashing into each other. I liked some of the faction ideas because the European forces, Vanguard PMC units, and Carpathians all had distinct visual styles and different battlefield approaches that kept matches from feeling identical. The resource node system was also a nice improvement since it encouraged map control instead of endlessly harvesting small piles beside the base. At the same time, the combat quickly became repetitive because most battles turned into giant, chaotic clashes without much tactical depth beyond overwhelming the enemy with numbers and support powers. The presentation and sound design are strong, but the gameplay still feels too familiar without enough fresh ideas standing out yet. This goes in my mediocre tier. Sudden Strike 5 gave me the large-scale World War II battles I wanted, especially during missions where tanks, infantry, artillery, and aircraft were all fighting across massive battlefields at the same time. I liked how terrain destruction and strategic positioning played an important role because controlling bridges, buildings, and defensive areas could completely change the direction of a battle. The different campaign factions and generals also added some variety, since each playstyle pushed me toward different tactics during missions. Visually, the maps and vehicles looked detailed, and the battlefield sound effects helped make every firefight feel chaotic and intense. My biggest issue came from the controls, because managing units and selecting troops quickly became frustrating during larger engagements, especially when trying to organize precise attacks. For me, it still deserves a place in my trash tier. Empire Eternal caught my attention because very few RTS games still attempt the massive era-spanning formula that games like Empire, Earth, and Rise of Nations used years ago. I liked seeing civilizations evolve from primitive settlements into futuristic superpowers because that sense of progression still feels exciting in strategy games when it is done properly. The variety of units across land, sea, and air battles also gives the game a lot of potential, especially with mechanics like scaling walls and boarding enemy ships, adding more activity during combat. I also appreciate the planned mod support since custom maps and units can massively extend the life of an RTS community. My problem is that the game still looks too rough and cluttered during large battles, making it difficult to clearly follow the action. Right now, this stays in my mediocre tier. Crimson Freedom instantly stood out to me because there are not many modern RTS games using a large-scale sci-fi war on Mars as the main setting anymore. I like the heavy focus on macro strategy, since too many newer RTS games rely on non-stop micromanagement that quickly becomes exhausting during longer matches. The visuals also looked surprisingly strong because the infantry, tanks, and large vehicles all felt properly scaled instead of looking like tiny toys fighting across the battlefield. I am also interested in the mysterious red resource being harvested on Mars because it feels like the kind of setup that could lead into interesting world building and faction conflicts later in the campaign. Right now, a lot of my excitement still depends on how much gameplay depth and faction variety the final release delivers, so this currently earns a place in my good tier. Space Tales has a retro, futuristic sci-fi style that gives it more personality than a lot of smaller RTS games releasing lately, especially with its colorful worlds and old-school robot designs. I liked some of the base expansion mechanics, because linking hubs together and deciding whether to turn them into defensive structures added at least a small layer of strategy during survival missions. The atmosphere also has a strange charm that made me curious to keep playing for a while longer than I expected. The problem is that the gameplay systems never become deep enough to fully support the presentation. Resource management, combat, and base building stay extremely simple, and after a few matches, the survival mode starts feeling repetitive without enough variety or challenge. The visuals and style help it stand out a little, but this still lands in my mediocre tier. ZeroSpace gave me the feeling of playing a modern RTS that clearly understands why people still love classics like StarCraft and Command and Conquer. I liked how each faction approached battles differently because the Protectorate focused on survivability and defensive strength, while the Legion mixed fragile armies with massive heavy units that completely changed the pace of combat. The large amount of faction variety and customization kept matches interesting, and I also enjoyed how active the developers seemed during testing, because the game still has rough edges that need refinement. Some mechanics can become overwhelming, since there are so many systems, counters, and unit interactions happening at once, especially during larger battles. A few factions also feel too heavily inspired by older RTS games instead of fully creating their own identity. This earns a place in my excellent tier. Immortal Gates of Pyre feels like a modern RTS built by people who clearly understand why classic strategy games still work today. I liked how the Immortal system added another layer to battles, because managing armies while timing powerful abilities kept matches active without becoming overwhelming. The faction variety also helped a lot since every nation encouraged different tactics, from aggressive assaults to slower defensive playstyles focused on positioning and map control. Visually, the game also stands out with colorful environments and detailed unit designs that make large battles easier to follow than many recent RTS releases. I also appreciate how much attention the developers give to community feedback and continued updates during early access. This earns a strong spot in my great tier. Diplomacy is not an option constantly kept me busy because it mixes huge survival battles with demanding resource management and tactical large-scale warfare. I liked how every mission forced me to balance food production, expanding the kingdom, defending choke points, and preparing armies before gigantic enemy waves smashed into my defenses. The combat became much more satisfying once I started understanding how cavalry, walls, catapults, and terrain positioning all work together during chaotic assaults. I also enjoyed how different faction choices and enemy types kept changing the flow of missions instead of repeating the same battles endlessly. The difficulty can become brutal very quickly, especially during longer missions where a single mistake can destroy hours of progress. The story and cutscenes are definitely weaker than the gameplay itself. This secures a place in my great tier. Sins of a Solar Empire 2 gave me exactly the kind of massive space strategy experience that very few RTS games can deliver today. I loved building huge interstellar empires, managing planets, expanding trade networks, and slowly assembling gigantic fleets capable of wiping entire star systems off the map. The large-scale battles looked incredible once capital ships, fighters, missiles, and defensive structures all started colliding during late-game wars. I also liked how different the factions and sub-factions felt, because each one pushed me toward completely different economic and military strategies during longer matches. The learning curve is definitely brutal at first, since the game throws massive systems and menus at players with very little guidance. This easily secures a place in my masterpiece tier. WARNO delivers some of the most intense large-scale Cold War battles I have played in a modern RTS, because every match depends on careful positioning, reconnaissance, and smart combined arms tactics. I liked how the pacing feels slower and more controlled compared to older Eugen Systems games, since larger battles never became overwhelming or impossible to follow. The line of sight system quickly became one of my favorite mechanics because it rewards proper scouting, defensive setups, and ambush tactics instead of blindly rushing armored units forward. Urban combat also feels much stronger here, because infantry can genuinely defend cities and force enemies into costly assaults across tightly packed streets and buildings. I also appreciated the amount of single-player content and the lengthy Army General campaigns that add plenty of replay value outside multiplayer matches. It earns a place in my excellent tier. Beyond All Reason feels like a classic large-scale RTS brought into the modern era with massive battles, absurd unit counts, and non-stop strategic chaos happening across gigantic maps. I liked how the game balances macro management and battlefield control, because even during enormous matches I still had tools that made managing armies and production feel smooth instead of overwhelming. The scale of combat is easily the biggest highlight, since entire landscapes become filled with tanks, artillery, aircraft, explosions, and defensive lines fighting all at once. I also enjoyed the physics systems because terrain, projectile ballistics, and positioning actually matter during battles instead of units simply trading damage in open fields. The faction designs can sometimes feel visually too similar, and the lack of a full campaign still leaves a noticeable gap. This belongs in my excellent tier. Age of Mythology Retold reminded me why mythological RTS games still feel so unique even decades later, because almost every battle mixes traditional armies with giant monsters, heroes, and god powers. I loved building civilizations while balancing human soldiers, mythical creatures, naval warfare, and powerful divine abilities that could completely shift the direction of battles. The visual overhaul also looks fantastic since the environments, oceans, units, and large cities all feel far more alive without losing the classic atmosphere of the original game. I also appreciated many of the gameplay improvements because commands like attack move and better pathfinding made battles smoother and less frustrating than older RTS games. The campaigns still have some awkward voice acting and weaker presentation in certain scenes, but the core gameplay remains incredibly strong. This easily secures a place in my masterpiece tier. That's my ranking for RTS games based on strategy depth, faction balance, and how well each game handles large-scale, real-time decision-making. Thanks for watching.